With that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. Again, if you're watching on Facebook, please share the stream. We appreciate it. For those on Zoom, thank you for joining us. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
So could you give everybody just a little bit of background about yourself and the center?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Bason. I'm the executive director with the Delaware Center for the Inland Bays. And we're a nonprofit organization with our headquarters at the Indian River Inlet, just south of Dewey Beach and north of Bethany. And our mission is to protect and restore Delaware's inland bays. So we do that by coordinating partners in the implementation of a management plan for the bays. We do a lot of education of the public about this amazing resource that we have here on the coast. We do a lot of water quality and habitat restoration projects. We have a focus on restoring oyster reefs, forests in the watershed, and wetlands. And we also do a lot of public policy work, which is something that we'll be talking about today with buffers. But the key to our success, and we have had a lot of success with our partners in restoring the bays, is bringing people together, volunteers, different businesses, government agencies, universities, and finding ways to work together to solve environmental problems.
Wonderful, thank you. So just to kind of keep it at a high level real quick, what are some of the various functions that the center does? I've seen a lot of events that you guys have done and cleanups and other things. So you just give people an idea on anything that they can get engaged with?
Sure. Science is at the foundation of everything that we do at the center. And all of our science projects are supported one way or the other by volunteers. So we've got a number of completely citizen science run projects, studying populations of horseshoe crabs, studying populations of fish that use the shore zone of the inland bays. We've added 2 projects this year, one studying the diamondback terrapin population of the inland bays. That's our iconic native estuarine turtle from our area that we really don't know too much about the population. And monitoring the existence of bay grass meadows in our bays, these underwater grasses that support so much life. So we just added those 2 on this year. We have tons of volunteer opportunities in terms of our education programs. We're out there in the community all the time, reaching out, teaching people about the bays, getting them involved. And we also encourage a lot of advocacy. We encourage folks to contact their elected officials and share with those people their values about clean water. So there's a lot of ways to get involved, and you can do that on our website, which is inlandbays.org. And our volunteer activities have been curtailed as of late, but we are, just like everybody else, really pushing for and hoping for a return to normal as soon as possible so we can get back out there and do the work of the watershed.
So what would you say is kind of the greatest threats to the wetlands and the inland bays in Delaware?
The bays are these amazing, robust, beautiful estuaries, but by their nature, they have very long flushing times. When the water from the land seeps in to these shallow lagoons, it stays there for a long time, as do any pollutants that come in with that water. And so they are very, very sensitive to pollution because of that. So nutrient pollution, excess fertilizers, wastewater, urban runoff, that is really the biggest threat to the quality of the inland bays right now. And over the years, they've really been scorched by too much nutrients coming in. Associated with that is habitat loss. The nutrients have nearly wiped out the meadows of bay grass that used to be a big part of our system. We've lost almost all of our oyster reefs that we've not been able to restore. So habitat loss is important. When we're talking about wetlands, we continue to lose wetlands. Even though we've got federal policy, state level policy, we continue to lose wetlands in Delaware and in the inland bays watershed at a rapid pace. So right now, filling of those wetlands for development and building in the way of the migratory pathways of wetlands. And that might sound a little arcane, but we'll talk a little bit about that more. And I think finally, more and more, the recognition that sea level rise and other impacts of climate change are a very large impact, not only on the bays themselves, but the communities that live around the bays.
Yeah, it is unreal how much, how far we have to go to protect something that should seem very foundational and very simple.
Yes.
We
should
all
have
watch,
solved the wetlands problem by now.
right. And I mean, we all watched Lion King, right? Like we all know like the circle of life, and we're all connected, and that we got to protect our ecosystems here in Delaware. But we got to keep pushing. So backing up just a little bit though, I think we use that term buffer in a lot of different ways. I know we're all about buffers today. But just so we're all kind of on the same page, what are we talking about when we're talking about buffers in the context of like ecology and wetlands?
Awesome question. Really important to ask and understand that, because there are so many different types of buffers when it comes to land use policy. So, if you're up in Newcastle County, you might, when you hear buffer, you might think about the buffer between an industrial site and an existing community or a new community coming in. You might think about a buffer between an existing community and another new community that is being built. But in terms of our conversation today, we are talking about buffers that are between wetlands and waterways and new developments. And the screen that you're seeing here is a really excellent example of what a pretty decent buffer looks like in that context. You see this development was underway at the time in terms of being constructed up here. And there's an area of forest that you see on your screen. And this is a functioning buffer between that development and Love Creek. So incidentally, Love Creek was one of the last remaining areas of the inland bays that supported baygrass meadows, and it still does. And one of the reasons we think that is because a buffer like this had been left in place. And there's a lot of wonderful scientific studies that show just how important leaving forested lands near the waters of an estuary is to protect the life in that estuary. So we've got something really special here in Love Creek, and it was great that the local citizens actually advocated to keep a very nice sized buffer here. This can be 300 feet in some places. And as it turns out, this is really an amenity for this community.
So that, you said that's about 300 feet wide?
Yeah, and at its widest, it could be like 300 to 400 feet here. And it's a mature, beautiful forest. When you walk down into it, you're in a forest. And you can see all the ecological differences and how it does buffer any kind of physical encroachment. It does take up any kind of pollution that might be coming off this development. And this development made the best out of it. They got a big kayak rack down there. They now have a little floating dock out on the creek, and they gather in this area. It's a true amenity for them.
Somebody asked, what development is that there?
I believe this is the retreat on Love Creek. And for those of you a little less familiar with the inland bays, this Love Creek is one of the major tributaries to Rehoboth Bay, which lies behind Dewey Beach and Rehoboth Beach in that area.
And are those retention ponds that you're kind of seeing in the development itself?
Correct. Yeah, this is a very traditional development layout. The stormwater ponds here have been constructed to control the runoff from most of the site, and they use those ponds also as amenities for the community.
Gotcha. Thank you for that example. I think it's always helpful to see in a real life example and graphic of what we're talking about here. It definitely helps. I appreciate it. So what are some of the other important functions that that buffers provide, and particularly around ecologically sensitive areas, and what would we see more of if they were not there, or I guess in some cases less of in the case of the meadows?
Well, as we alluded to, buffers do control flooding by controlling runoff into a water body or a wetland. By being left as natural areas, they can capture and hold precipitation. They also protect the ability of wetlands to do that themselves. They also are fantastic at controlling water pollution, particularly nutrient pollution. And there's a great body of evidence that shows that a well-designed buffer can actually trap up to 80% of the nitrogen that might be passing through it or passing under it to discharge to a waterway or a stream. Buffers allow space for wetlands, particularly salt marshes, to migrate inland with sea level rise. And buffers also maintain critical wildlife habitat adjacent to wetlands and water bodies. And I always tell people that the life of the estuary doesn't stop at the water's edge. Ecological connections of the estuary stretch inland into the uplands. And a great example of that is the diamondback terrapin. It spends its whole life in the estuary, except when it needs to lay its eggs to have its babies. And at that point, it travels out of the water across the marshes, and it finds sandy soils in the uplands nearby to lay its eggs. It has to have those areas, just like herons and egrets and even bald eagles have to have forests near the estuary to raise their young. So it is all connected, and there's a lot of great information to show the types of buffers you need to maintain those functions.
So what are some of the, you're talking about nutrient runoff and pollution. What are some of the nutrients that we see the most of? I think you spoke about nitrates. And what are the sources of those nutrients? Where are they coming from, and how can we perhaps prevent them from accumulating and coming through certainly they're not great even in the buffer area to be absorbed. If we can reduce the amount that they're having to absorb, that would be beneficial as well.
So nutrients come from a variety of sources. In Delaware, some of the big ones are from agriculture. And the reason is not because agriculture is not trying to reduce the nutrients, but because our soils, particularly in southern Delaware, are just so sandy, you just naturally lose a lot of the fertilizers that are applied. And they go into the groundwater. And that groundwater travels through the aquifer and it eventually discharges into places like the inland bays. But it usually passes near a buffer or through a buffer or a wetland. And so if we can establish buffers and protect our wetlands, we have a chance of intercepting those nutrients. But in addition to agriculture, nutrients result from land-based application of wastewater, which is very prevalent in Kent and Sussex County. They come from urban runoff, from existing and new developments. And once in a stream network, they just travel downstream and they might spill out with floodwaters into wetlands or different areas. So buffers on a site like we saw down there, they are not just protecting against the development in one single community, but they are also protecting against pollution and runoff from a number of other communities and sources upstream.
What do you think the ratio is between one of the downsides of development is we get a lot more grass. and usually they're tearing up the dirt and tearing up the soil and the grass that's there, and they have to lay down new grass and they fertilize it. So what do you think the ratio is between agriculture and things like consumer fertilizer runoff and that sort of thing?
In terms of the source, like what's being applied and what makes it in the water, it is I would say more nutrients are coming from agriculture in the land-based watershed. And it's simply because you might put 150 to 200 pounds of nitrogen down per acre of corn, right? And if you lose 20% of that naturally to the groundwater just because of the inefficiency of the system, I mean, that's a lot of nitrogen. But in, the more developments we build, the more developments displace forests and wetlands, the greater the source from fertilized turf becomes. And, in our region, fertilized turf is a significant source of nutrients to surface waters.
Hey, we got a good question from Shelly. Can you hear me all right? Am I glitching out a little bit? Yeah, I'm gonna plug in.
I think both of you you're both can hear you fine. Thank you.
Great.
Hey, Shelly.
So
Hi there. How you doing, Chris?
Shelly asked if when we're talking about buffers, we're ideally talking about substantial strips of old growth forests and native plants. So the question is, if a developer rips out the forest and the old growth trees and the native plants, it says they'll comply because they're going to plant new trees. Does this serve the same purpose? So I guess, is old growth better than new growth? And what happens if the developer uses non-native trees and plants? Are natives better than non-natives?
That's a really clear, easy answer and a great question that gets at a lot of what's going on in Sussex County right now. But you have in existing forests, you have a tremendous value there economically to the people that live in the area. You have tremendous stores of nutrients locked up in the wood and the plants and in the soils of that forest, and a tremendous capacity by those trees to intercept precipitation, to soak rainwater into the soils, and to mitigate flooding and the extreme precipitation events that we're having. When you cut all that down, you lose all that function, you lose all that value. Typically, what you see in developments is that the native species are taken out and the non-native species are put in, and that provides just very little wildlife value compared to the native species. And I won't go into that too much, but I would refer you to some wonderful work coming out of the University of Delaware by Professor Doug Ptolemy, who's got a number of books that have really, I think, become seminal environmental works about the value of native plants to ecosystems, and the fact that we can't expect nature to be protected and sustained just from parkland. We have to protect and sustain nature in our backyards and in our communities. And that's another really important value of native forested buffer.
So just a quick plug, we will be having another live stream. Well, we have them every week, but we will be having one focused on native plants again. We had one about what native plants you can plant at your home, but we're going to be actually having one about this topic, about native plants and how invasives can really damage our ecology. And we are seeing almost an extinction level sort of event here in our ecology in Delaware. We're losing a lot of our wild fauna because of the invasive flora and the way that trickles down. So we will be having an event on that. So make sure you stay tuned to our calendar on that. Chris, if you could type out the UD professor's name or spell it out for everyone. Had somebody ask how they spell the last name on that.
Sure thing, you got it.
So we had a couple more questions, and we will we'll get to more audience questions as well. What's kind of the current status of the water quality in Delaware? And obviously buffers can improve this. How about in regards to flooding as well, though?
Yeah, so in terms of flooding, I'm going to share my screen with you here to help kind of illustrate where we are. We've got some serious problems in Delaware that are being exacerbated by sea level rise and extreme precipitation events. So in Sussex County, we are probably the lowest lying county and the lowest lying state in the nation. And I'll share this screen here with you just to kind of give you a sense of what's happening. I believe our communities are flooding more and more severely, and these are some images that kind of show you just how severe that some of this flooding could be. This is Bethany Beach in 2019. This is a sunny day flooding event from a nor'easter that was offshore. This is Long Neck from that same nor'easter sunny day flooding event. And this is Fenwick Island from Superstorm Sandy. And it's really a great example of what happens when you don't have buffers, right? There are absolutely no buffers here along these residential canals. And it was probably the most impacted area of the state for when Superstorm Sandy came through. We are losing our natural defenses for flooding. This is the acreage of salt marsh in the inland bays, and you can see how it's steadily declining over time. So there was recently a pretty interesting news story about a new report out that kind of contrasted FEMA's approach to mapping flood zones with a more forward-looking approach. And it found that Delaware as a state was really in trouble when it came to the number of people that could be affected by flooding in the future as exacerbated by sea level rise. And that was in addition to a 2019 study from Climate Central that found that Sussex County was in the top 3 counties for new homes being created in flood-prone areas due to sea level rise projections in the future. So we're having difficulty now in Sussex County, and that is only going to increase. So from a flood control standpoint, having more space in between new communities and the water and wetlands is really important.
So what are we doing right now to protect the current buffers we have from degrading? And to make sure that we are placing the buffers that you're talking about with new developments, and making sure that we have buffer requirements where we need them moving forward in Delaware.
Part of the reason for this work recently at the county level in Sussex to improve the buffer ordinance was because the existing ordinance, as they tell it, is hard to enforce. And over the years, we've had some really bad examples of buffers that were either not applied or just not enforced when after the neighborhood was built. And this is a great example of a buffer that was torn down here for a campground on Indian River Bay at Massey's Landing. Here's another wonderful example of homes that were built around about 2007, just right on the water with no buffer at all. And another example here on the salt pond near Bethany Beach, there just wasn't an application of this ordinance. And that's a problem because as soon as these developments go in, their property begins to erode and they have to, harden their shoreline, which further degrades the bay. So given that the center and other groups have been really asking the county to do better on enforcement, I think lately we have seen them doing a better job enforcing the ordinance. And there's a shared belief that if we can get this updated ordinance in place, it will make enforcing it a lot easier for the county. But in terms of the buffers now, most of them are the responsibility of the homeowners associations in which they occur. So they're ultimately responsible for maintaining them.
Interesting. So what, are you hearing any arguments against the ordinance or against, improving buffers?
The biggest arguments are that requiring a developer or a landowner to put in buffers in their development is against property rights, is against individual property rights, which is a very important value for many people that live in Sussex County. It's often criticized as a takings, as a regulatory takings, but legally, expanding a buffer ordinance is not even close to a regulatory takings. But many people, that doesn't matter. It just, to them, government should have no intrusion on property rights, and everybody should be able to do what they want with their property. It's a very idealistic viewpoint. And so those opinions are hard to argue against because they're very kind of entrenched in a lot of people. But the other side of that coin is that we all have rights as property owners to enjoy the amenities and to stay safe. And, amenities are our ecosystems in Sussex County. And so buffers certainly maximize the economic value for the most people. And in fact, these very small changes that the county is considering now to its buffer ordinance would only apply to a small portion of existing property owners. And it would require them, if they build a large subdivision on their property, to take small steps on the site design of the communities. So it would probably not even reduce the number of houses that they could build in their community by very much, and in some cases not at all. So there's a tremendous amount of logic and reason on why this should be expanded to protect wildlife and reduce flooding and protect water quality, which is our resources in Sussex County are the backbone of our economy. We're a tourism-based economy, and all of the water quality that we have right now benefits the real estate and construction industry.
So we had a couple other questions. Somebody asked about the spraying of invasive seagrasses, hydrilla. Does this, not sure if I'm unfamiliar. Does this harm wild aqualife, native water grasses, or individuals?
That's a great question. That is a freshwater species of aquatic plant, and I don't know too much about its control. But I know that, like any invasive species, it really takes over and displaces the habitat for other native species. So by controlling it, you're bringing back habitat for other native species. But I don't really know too much about the threats associated with herbicides used to control.
So how do you work with those who do not believe in sea level rise?
That's a tough one. We keep at it. We understand everybody has their opinion and the choice, but we keep at it. We keep sharing the information. We take the opportunity to show people the photographs in the presentation that I showed you. Those are very powerful images, and in my observation of doing this since 2004, I've seen a number of turning points in people's perception about sea level rise. And the biggest was Superstorm Sandy. After that, people in municipalities that we work with were much more comfortable talking about sea level rise and adaptation concepts. So I've observed that there are tipping points in time where people's perceptions change, and I know that people's perceptions will continue to change and continue to accept sea level rise. It's going to take a lot of time, and we're going to keep at educating people about that and being brave about it. You can't kind of back off speaking the truth about it, but eventually people will come around to it.
So when you're talking about takings, could you explain that a little bit more? Is that equivalent to like eminent domain is the question?
Yeah, that it does kind of relate to that. Essentially, I'm not a lawyer, but in broad terms, the government cannot take away the entirety of someone's economic value on their property without compensating them. And as this concept has gone through the courts and even the Delaware courts, the extent to which that applies has been tested. And so it's perfectly legal for a government to perhaps reduce the things that somebody can do on their property, which could potentially reduce their total economic potential on the property, but they just can't take it entirely away. So that's pretty clear that this enhanced ordinance would not be a taking.
So the another question regarding the discussions you've had with those concerned over the landowner rights. Are you also hearing any of those individuals be kind of concerned about sort of the greater good, conserving the environment for future generations, kind of being good stewards of the land? Are you hearing that? What's the ratio there?
Yeah, there's a lot of support. First of all, there's a lot of support right now in Sussex County for improved environmental protection. I've never seen so many people involved and engaged effectively. There's a number of people on this call that are a part of that, and they are making real changes. So the movement for clean water in Sussex is fantastic, and it's awesome to be a part of that and be working with those people that are having so much success. When we started to work as a group on developing this ordinance at the request of Sussex County Council, it became apparent that there was a lot of agreement among a group of about 13 stakeholders on how to do this. There was a lot of compromise in this working group, and we've produced a draft ordinance that is very reasonable. It certainly doesn't do a lot of things. It doesn't address sea level rise. It could go a whole lot farther on a number of things in terms of protection. But you got to realize and recognize we're dealing with a 5-member council in Sussex, and many of them hold very conservative viewpoints centered on property rights. So there are some, social and political realities that we're working under. But the most important thing is that this is taking a big step forward on an issue that is extremely important to Sussex
County. What about the old farming families that have been around that area for a really long time and certainly have a lot of the land and a lot of the economic and political power down there as well? Were they a part of that stakeholder group that you mentioned, or have you heard anything from them?
Yeah, so a couple of examples there. Jay Baxter with Baxter Farms was on the work group and has participated the entire time. All of our discussions have been cordial and intelligent, and he did not show up completely against this. He showed up to work and compromise. Another example would be Rob Tunnel with Tunnel Companies, who owns and manages Potnets and a number of businesses and develops large residential communities as well. Participated the whole time. And, in the work group, we're all working together, and we will see where this goes once it gets solidly into the political realm. when it goes public for Sussex County Council.
Do we happen to have any idea on when that will be yet? Is coronavirus still kind of making it hard to determine?
Yeah, you're right, Dustin. It's a tough one, and what I was told is that it's going to be I suppose maybe until we can get back together as a work group in person until this moves forward. But I really don't know. I'm just kind of speculating there, and that'll be up to the county administration and the council on how to handle that.
Great, thank you. We are a little bit over time, so I do want to wrap this up. Chris, if people want to get engaged on this issue, are there meetings that the center is holding, maybe virtually right now, that people can kind of maybe get more information or help you out?
Thank you. Yeah, we do have plenty of information resources, and I want to share that with you. This is on our website here, a page that we have dedicated to some Sussex County ordinances. But it has a number of reports on it. The center has an extensive fact sheet about the ordinance and frequently asked questions, a lot of detail and a lot of science behind different aspects of buffers in the ordinance. We have a science-based report on what we think buffers should look like in the inland bays watershed, as well as some other fact sheets and guidebooks that can help those that are interested in learning more about buffers. We certainly encourage anybody who is a resident and a voter in Sussex County or otherwise to get informed about the issue, understand what buffers can do for their communities. And if you are a resident of Sussex County, just like anybody, it's really important that you communicate your values to your elected officials so that they know. And it just, standard participation in the public process is going to be really important. So we are committed to keeping people posted. If they want more information, they can sign up for our e-blasts and updates on this. And we're very much looking forward to the time when it can come to council. And I'm optimistic that we will get an improved buffer ordinance that will benefit the people of Sussex.
Great. If you could give me that email address, we can share that out with everybody as well, or sorry, website. We can get that shared out with everybody and post it when we have this up on our website as well. So I appreciate you joining us. Nancy asked if you had a meeting on Friday.
Yeah, I think we do. I'm thinking we got a meeting of our Science and Technical Advisory Committee on Friday. So check out our website for that. It's a Zoom meeting. It's a remote meeting. I know that we're talking about our environmental monitoring plan and a couple other things that we're focused on science-wise at the center.
Great. Yeah, we can put that up as well. So thank you everybody for joining on the Zoom. Thank you everybody who has been watching us on Facebook. Greatly appreciate everybody joining, and thank you so much, Chris, for all the work that you're doing with everybody downstate, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity, Dustin. Thanks for having me on. It's good to see everybody.
Absolutely. Everybody be well.